And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another emergency, unexpected episode of the Assembly Call, but a good one, as news broke earlier Friday, that Trayce Jackson-Davis is staying with Indiana. So, hey, newsflash, your Hoosier Proud banner moment. Trayce Jackson-Davis is coming back and seems very excited about doing so. And, as you know, when news breaks, when there's something happening in the world of IU basketball, we like to hop on live and do a show. Unfortunately, I had some, actual real job stuff, some real work stuff going on when the news broke this afternoon, so we couldn't hop on right away. But Friday night, was able to get Galen Clavio ready to go, and we did a live show talking about Trayce Jackson-Davis being back, and just, kind of our impressions of the first week of the Mike Woodson Era and everything that's going on. A wide-ranging conversation. Galen and I haven't talked recently, so we had a lot to talk about. Really fun conversation. So we're going to get to that, and I will play that first. And then stick around after the conversation with Galen, or if you're not interested in that, you can skip ahead too, about an hour. But Sam Vecenie from The Athletic was cool enough to hop on with me for about 15 minutes, pretty soon after the news about Trayce broke. He only had a short period of time, so we had to make it kind of quick. But we talked about Trayce Jackson-Davis, his NBA prospects, what he needs to work on, and then also who else from the IU roster is on the NBA radar. So first up is a conversation with Galen. Then we've got the conversation with Sam Vecenie after that. And the last thing that I want to remind you of, we've been telling you about Playbook products. They sell the stone coasters and the leather coasters for not just Indiana basketball, but for basically any professional sports team and a whole bunch of other college teams. If you haven't checked them out yet, use the URL assemblycall.com/pp. I set that up so it would just be as easy as possible for you to type in on your mobile device or your computer, assemblycall.com/pp. It will redirect you to their site, and when you use that URL, if you go on there and decide to buy any of their really cool products, we get a 15% commission. So think about it. Go check them out. I have those coasters. Andy got them for me as a gift. They're really, really neat. They also have mugs, but they've got something for everyone there. So even if you don't decide to get something now, save it, for the next time that you have a gift coming up. Father's Day is coming up. There's a lot of different, obviously, times throughout the year when you might need a quick gift. And Playbook products, they do good work, and it's high-quality stuff. So assemblycall.com/pp. Get a great product, and you support the Assembly Call in the process. All right. Without further ado, let's get to it, and we will start with my conversation with Galen Clavio. Well, there's that sound, and you've been hearing that sound a lot over the past few weeks, as there's been a lot of breaking news, a lot of reason for emergency podcasts here with the Assembly Call, and today is certainly a joyful one, as Trayce Jackson-Davis announced today that he is going to be returning to Indiana University to play for Mike Woodson for his junior season, and obviously this is news that warrants a special edition podcast, so we had to fire one up. So I'm here, Jared Morris, here with the doctor, Galen Clavio. Galen, I feel like there's been all these podcasts, and you and I haven't had a chance to just get together and talk, so I'm glad we have this opportunity today.
I told you this on text. I was actually getting ready to just have a powwow between you and me next week. So, this is as good of a time as any to make it happen.
Yeah. What better time than, one of the better big men in school history deciding to come back for a third season. I'll take that.
Yeah.
So let's break that down, because that is obviously the big news. I think most of us went into last season thinking there was very little chance of Trayce coming back. Like, I think everybody kind of looked at his sophomore season as, okay, this is, the last year he's going to be here. He'll go on either to the NBA or to play professionally. And certainly, nothing really happened during the season to change that. I mean, he didn't really move up NBA draft boards. In fact, he probably fell a little bit just because he didn't really show any type of expansion in his game. But, once Archie's fired, you've got all this uncertainty around the program. It seemed more likely than not that he would go. And in fact, if you listen to Trayce's comments today at his press conference, it sounded like that was very much what they were assuming, even when they went in to talk to Mike Woodson. But, after spending, Trayce said he had a one-on-one conversation with him, then he and his parents went in for 2 hours, and Mike Woodson convinced him that it's in his best interest to come back. And he didn't, to me, listening to that press conference, he didn't sound like a guy who was just kind of like, resigned to coming back, or, like, well, I guess I got to come back and do this. he sounded like a guy who was really committed to the idea and to the process of becoming a better player. And not only that, but leading this team to something greater, and a guy who's maybe thinking a little bit bigger about his legacy and what it's going to mean. What are his years at Indiana going to mean? So, which was very encouraging for all IU fans to hear. So I'm curious, what was your reaction to the news that Trayce is coming back and to his comments about it?
I echo a lot of your sentiments on that. I think it's important to keep this in mind, and I was trying to tell people this throughout the course of the season, whether it was on the podcast or just in regular conversation. Going to the NBA isn't the end-all be-all of being a professional basketball player. And being in college is not the end-all be-all of your development. It's not like you come out fully formed from college in most cases. I say in all cases, like you're constantly growing even afterwards. And so even if Trayce Jackson-Davis wasn't going to get drafted, and it certainly didn't look like he was going to, given the mock drafts that we saw and some of the comments from people out there about his game, I still thought he was going to leave if Archie Miller was still the coach. And a lot of what I heard in the press conference today kind of confirmed that because there was a subtext to a lot of what Trayce Jackson-Davis was talking about. And I'm not even going to talk about the darkness and light yet. We'll talk about that later. Yeah. But the idea of wanting to be challenged and wanting to be told what he needs to do in order to be a pro prospect, like a guy that can actually get drafted in the NBA, and having somebody say, this is what I want you to work on, this is what I want you to do in games in order to get there. So to me, it's huge news on a variety of levels. I think it's going to be great for Trayce because even though going to the NBDL or what the D League or whatever they call it now, or going to Europe is certainly a path that you can go through to get to the NBA, it's, I think, a better overall track right now for a lot of players, particularly a player like Trayce Jackson-Davis, who's already good at a lot of things, to be able to work in the environment that he's already used to. And now he's got NBA coaching coming in the form of Mike Woodson and whoever his assistants are to help him get there. So I was pleasantly surprised. I kind of got a sense when we didn't hear Trayce leave immediately that he might be back, but it was so heartening to hear that it was the message from Mike Woodson specifically about what he needed to do to get to the NBA that made him want to stay. And I don't know if we've had that at IU in a while, quite frankly.
Galen, I can't make sense of this, because I was told that Mike Woodson wouldn't be able to recruit. And I was told that Indiana had paid $10 million to just kind of piss away the 2021-22 season. So can you make sense of this for me, please?
Well, I also, all I do is follow national college basketball writers, and they still have not mentioned that Trayce Jackson-Davis is going to stay at Indiana. So I'm assuming that he's actually leaving. That he's not coming back, because it hasn't been broken by any of the major people out there. So you got me.
That was always so absurd. It really was. And, part of the reason why that entire narrative was absurd is kind of the subtext that you were mentioning from Trayce, where he kind of talked about how the mood has changed and it feels like there's light now and there had basically been no energy, which essentially lets you know that Trayce and the players felt exactly how we felt about the program coming down the stretch. It was kind of lifeless. It felt like a kind of a dead program walking there at the end of the season. And, I think that's why there was such excitement, renewed enthusiasm when Archie Miller was let go, because it was like, look, I don't care what the next direction is. We just need a new direction. And you were very clear about, you've got to decouple moving on from Archie Miller and who we get. Right. And so, we moved on, now, obviously Mike Woodson gets hired. We're all kind of wondering how that's going to go. Well, so far it's going pretty well, because a lot of the people that Coach Woodson is trying to get back, Kenya Hunter, Parker Stewart, Trayce Jackson-Davis, those guys are returning, and it's shaping up to make next season really interesting. Because, you can say, okay, so you're going to bring back the same roster that lost its last 6-7 games and wasn't very good. How's that going to be better? To which I would say, look at what Justin Smith did this year. Leaving Indiana, going to another program, he wasn't a demonstrably different player. He was mostly the same player in a system that was able to take advantage of his skills and bring out his enthusiasm for basketball, which makes a big difference, and you saw the difference in him. Now, take a roster of those guys. We may find out that the weight of the system that they were playing under and just, the lack of imagination and the lack of freedom that they had under the previous staff was really kind of weighing everything down. And that's kind of what Trayce was alluding to. And so if you can bring a lot of those guys back and you get that kind of bounce, it starts to really give you a lot of optimism for what the team could be as quickly as next year. And I don't want to put the cart, I'm not going to be like Scott here and, start projecting that Indiana might go undefeated next year, which I'm sure he will do at some point this offseason.
Probably tomorrow.
Yeah,
yes.
probably tomorrow. But you know what I mean? Like you hear Trayce talk like that and it's like, there may really be something to that, and we have talented players. These guys were highly ranked recruits. Boy, let's put them in a different system that they believe in. Could really have something.
I think it's a key point. And I really, I had a hard time believing that all of the people that Archie Miller's era brought in were bad basketball players. Like he had recruited guys that just couldn't play, because we saw many of them play in high school. We saw highlights of them. We saw shooting numbers that were very good. They came to IU and they suddenly couldn't shoot. They couldn't score. They had trouble defending. Everything was a slog night after night. I don't think that was the players. I mean, I think obviously I'm not pinning everything on Archie Miller, and I do want to be careful about, it's easy to kind of pile on too much after the fact. I mean, I'm sure that there was some blame to be shared going around, but the core of IU the last 4 years, from my vantage point, has been a team that hasn't really had a lot of fun doing anything on the floor, and a system that was ill-suited to bringing out the best of those players' talents. And frankly, I think that that's something that we all need to keep in mind, is that with the roster that is currently in Bloomington, with maybe a couple of additions, even if you lose a player or two, I think that there are players here that can win right away. And that was one of the things that Trayce Jackson-Davis mentioned that impressed him about Mike Woodson's message, was that he doesn't want to rebuild. He wants to win now. He wants and he seems to feel like he's got the pieces to be able to do that. Look, there's a lot of complicated aspects of basketball, and I think across the board, you can tell when a team is playing to its full potential. You can tell when a team is having fun, and then you can tell when teams really struggle. I point people to Texas over the last 5 years, where Shaka Smart's teams really struggled in those same areas. Like there's a lot of parallels, in my opinion, between Archie at Indiana and Shaka at Texas. Shaka got it going a little bit here this season, but it still felt like, well, this isn't as good as it should be, and it certainly looks a lot different from how it looked when he was coaching at VCU. Does it mean Shaka became a terrible coach? Not necessarily, but I think it probably meant it was a bad fit, bad cultural fit. Maybe a level a bit too high for where he was ready to go at that point in his career. And I think with Archie Miller is much the same. So to hear a guy like Trayce Jackson-Davis, who took a lot of criticism from various corners, I'm sure I was critical at various points throughout the season at certain things that I saw, but, was always ready to get fired up emotionally. The few times that we saw him, really try to galvanize his teammates, I think what we saw in the press conference today in his message is, there's a really, really excellent player. There's a potential top 20, top 30 all-time Indiana player there. And we just haven't seen the potential get tapped. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of what's happened over the last week or so.
Well, I agree. I was thinking after watching his press conference, his 2 seasons, statistically, and the burden that was placed on him was really so impressive. And yet, if you compare, like if he had just left after this season, and you compare kind of the feelings that his 2 years generated compared to what Thomas Bryant's 2 years generated, or compared to what Cody Zeller's 2 years generated, it wouldn't have been a comparison, because those guys, kind of put up their numbers and produced on teams that were just so much different, that were so much more successful, in part because they were just more well put together and had better players around them. And that would have been the real shame of Trayce's 2 years if it had just been at 2 years. Now he comes back for this 3rd year, and he's got a chance, to obviously not just take the next step statistically, but as a leader, and to actually lead this team to something. And I think, there's something special about, a guy like him, where he's got the option to go. If he wanted to go, he could go. And him stepping back in with 2 feet and saying, I want to be here. Like, there is now a different relationship between Trayce Jackson-Davis and Indiana fans when you do that, I feel. Now, obviously, you got to go and produce on the court and all of those things, but that's really something special and special to see. And I think it just shows the mindset of a guy that really took a mature, long-term view of this decision, which not a lot of guys do. I think it's going to serve him well. Whether next season goes perfectly or not, I think it's going to serve him well because it's going to allow him to leave something lasting here, whereas if he had just left, it would have been like, boy, those 2 years were weird,
I think it's something that took me a long time to figure out. I mean, I'm 41 years old. I've been watching IU basketball since I was 4, and it's easy to misconstrue what players think and feel about the places that they're at the college level. And you see players come and go, and we tend to project a lot of our emotions or a lot of our thoughts on individual players. And we think that we know how they felt or whether they cared or not about being at a place. And, Trayce Jackson-Davis, I think, is a guy who took some arrows for people feeling like he didn't care. And I think a lot of it is probably just him being really frustrated, not at being at Indiana, but being in the situation that he found himself in at Indiana. And, so I agree with you. Like the statements that you hear out of Trayce Jackson-Davis today and the time that he took to make a decision on this and being willing to listen to an incoming coach and accept that message and basically say, you know what, this is a place I want to be. This is, I don't want to leave unfinished business. I don't want to run out when things are bad. I want to bring this back to the top. It makes me wonder sometimes about a lot of the impressions people had, like of players during the Davis era, where the impression was, oh, these guys don't care about being at IU or this or that. And I don't think that was true, but we do have a tendency when things are bad to feel negatively towards the players that are part of the situation that is bad, rather than feeling bad about the situation and thinking, well, the players probably really do want to be here. It's just a matter of the circumstances aren't right. And I look at that with other players on this team. I mean, if Rob Phinisee comes back, I'm really fascinated to see, how does his performance change? And
Trayce singled him out by name in his press conference.
Exactly. And there's other players like that. I think Rob's probably the one that's gotten the most negative attention. But when you listen to the comments that Trayce had today about the atmosphere in general around the program and, the limited nature of his role, which I extrapolated to, well, gosh, there must have been a lot of limited roles for other people. And that's something we have heard as well from the previous couple of years, like with the Romeo Langford year and how all of that went. I don't know. I mean, so much of what we thought that we knew about IU basketball over the past 4 years, it's like the thread keeps getting unraveled bit by bit. And it's like, gosh, this was a really unfortunate situation for everybody involved. And, it's a shame because there's some squandered talent, there's some squandered years, and, there's a lot of frustration that's probably been misplaced in terms of how all of this has gone over the last 4 years and the way that fans and podcasters and writers have reacted to it.
Yeah. So let me just play devil's advocate for a second, because it's the off season. Hope springs eternal. You see something like this, your mind runs wild with all the ways that it can go right. And I think it's perfectly fair to think about all the ways that it can go right, because there's a lot of reason to think that this will go right. Yeah. But how might this go wrong? Like Trayce is talking about how, Coach Woodson basically told him, if you don't shoot, I'm going to take you out of the game. Well, let's be fair. I love Trayce as a player. The one thing that he hasn't shown is that he can make a shot consistently. Now, maybe that's because, like a lot of guys, they didn't seem comfortable shooting because they were always looking over their shoulder, were they supposed to shoot, kind of seemed, and he even said, we played so many sets, we didn't play free, so maybe that will open that up. But, you do also run the risk when a guy is quite clearly not only thinking about what he can do here to win games now, but also what he needs to do to showcase himself for the NBA. This is kind of going to be a first test right off the bat for Mike Woodson and right off the bat for this template that Scott Dolson has kind of laid out for how the IU basketball program will be, for how you balance winning games at Indiana and also, letting players develop and showcasing them for the next level. That can work and it cannot work. Do you have any concerns about that, especially with a guy like Trayce, who essentially needs to show things that he hasn't shown us that he can do yet?
It's always uncomfortable for IU fans to think about players operating on an individual basis. I think it's so ingrained in the DNA of the IU basketball mind that this has to be a team game and people have to act in a team manner. And I think there are many players for whom that is a good, but probably a preferred option because they work in that. But every once in a while, you get a player that is capable of much more than that because they are a legitimate professional basketball prospect. I think Trayce Jackson-Davis is definitely that. He's got the bloodlines. He's got the demonstrated ability. I mean, he was still, one of the most efficient scorers in college basketball this season, even with essentially being told, hey, we're going to tie you to a rope that only allows you to get 6 feet away from the basket in any direction. And you have to shoot all of those shots from, there or in. So I understand the potential concern, but I think most people will tell you if you're told don't shoot, you're going to think, well, I there's probably a reason why I'm being told I can't shoot. And yet, to be a professional basketball player, to be somebody that can take it to the next level, you have to be able to shoot from essentially everywhere on the floor. That's the way that the game is now. And so I would be more concerned about it if we had an assistant coach who didn't have 10 years as a head coach in the NBA coming in and telling Trayce Jackson-Davis, shoot from everywhere. If you don't shoot, we're going to sit you down. With someone like Mike Woodson, I think we need to quickly stop taking for granted the idea that we know more about how to operate these types of players, like this specific type of player, the type of player that Mike Woodson has coached either as a head coach or an assistant coach for the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. I think he understands what that is supposed to look like and what it can be. And I don't think he's just going in there saying, hey, just, shoot from wherever, da-da-da-da. I think he's got a vision and he's got a plan in place. And, could that be naive? Sure. Perhaps it could be. But we just had a head coach who had college experience, who had a very restrictive idea of how to use this really, really effective piece. And I'm willing to give it a try going a different direction because I think there are going to be a lot more yields. And frankly, I think it's not just Trayce Jackson-Davis being told to go shoot. And yes, we haven't seen him shoot that much. And certainly it'll be a work in progress. But he's also been blanketed by defenses because we've had zero spacing on offense for the 2 years that he's been here. We've had very little passing of note other than, in the last 10 seconds when we're desperate to find a shot. Like, there's a whole offensive system that you can build around a guy with this skill set. And if he can also shoot, now it opens up the floor for everybody else while everybody else is opening up the floor for him. So I'm not trying to, negate the devil's advocate approach here, but I'm willing to give this a shot because I think that all the pieces are there and the person who's going to be pulling the strings has a pretty good idea what they're going to be doing.
Yeah, I agree with you. And look, Trayce hasn't necessarily yet shown the ability to make outside shots, but he has shown the ability to be effective off the dribble, facing up and being able to do some things there. And so, this is kind of the next step for him is to be able to step out and make those shots.
Jared, you're old enough. You remember when people freaked out when Kirk Haston took a 3-pointer that first time? It was like, like an albino wolf landed, off a comet, but it was like, hey, wow, he hit that. And he regularly started shooting from out there. And I was like, wait, we can have a 6'10" guy who shoots from three?
Amazing.
I'm not saying Trayce Jackson-Davis is going to be as effective as Kirk Haston was, popping out and shooting from outside, but there's no reason why he can't be. And it's very possible we just never saw that part of his game because there was such a dedication in this last offensive scheme to keeping him close to the basket because that's what the scheme said that you needed, not what the player was able to do necessarily.
Yeah, you really hit on something, though, because I think it's fair to be really skeptical of how effective Trayce will be facing up and taking shots. He expressed a lot of confidence in it in the press conference, which is exactly what he should do. We can all have our doubts until we see it. But where I really like it is Trayce getting the ball, facing the basket, at the elbow or on the baseline, and then being able to drive. But he's only going to be able to do that with spacing.
Yep.
So the point that you made is so important about being able to space the floor with shooters. That's why a guy like Parker Stewart is so important. That's why Rob Finney playing with more freedom and more confidence is so important. Hopefully getting Armon Franklin back will be important because he's shown himself to be a good shooter. And then that brings up an interesting question about what do you do at the 4 spot? We're waiting to hear what Race Thompson is going to do. And it's interesting now that, Trayce talking like he did, Mike Woodson kind of talking about this kind of more open offensive system. Part of the issue for Indiana last year is that really, two of your three most consistent players were Trayce and Race, guys who really didn't show the ability to shoot it and did most of their work from inside. That is going to limit what you can do offensively. So as we look toward this brighter, faster, more open future, how do you see a guy like Race fitting into that if he were to come back? Or do you think that now it's better for Indiana, as good as a guy like Race is, it would be better for Indiana to play not necessarily Jerome Hunter, but a guy like Jerome Hunter with that, maybe like a Cole Swider from Villanova if you get him as a transfer. Is that really more the ideal that's going to work better for what Mike Woodson wants to do?
I mean, I think you could go multiple directions here. It's interesting because the way that Race Thompson has evolved, he showed a desire occasionally to pop out and take the three, and he wasn't afraid to take it. He didn't always hit them. I think he was only 20% for the season, but he took 15 shots throughout the course of the year. Look, I think what Race Thompson provides you is a guy who can come in and play in the spot that Trayce Jackson-Davis would be playing in when he needs a breather potentially. But you've also got the ability to have a guy who can go out and screen primarily. Like, not everybody on the floor has to score all the time. Right. There's a way to play players in different combinations, as you know, that allows for a variety of different looks. And from my perspective, if you're rolling into the next season and you've got a post that consists of Trayce Jackson-Davis, Race Thompson, and Joey Brunk, like, that's a pretty good rotation of guys. And there's going to be certain games where Race is going to play big. There's going to be games, I think, where he's playing in a smaller slot. I don't see why, you couldn't take advantage of that. Now, you may look at the transfer portal and say, gosh, there might be better options. And it might be that Race Thompson looks at the transfer portal and says, I got a chance to go home and spend my final year. You've got Logan Duncombe, as Jay just mentioned in the chat, and that's another body, and we're not exactly sure how he's going to flesh out either. But I don't think that any of the players right now don't fit with what we've heard Mike Woodson wants to do quite yet. And we think we know what these players can do, but I'm still not convinced that we've seen the full array of possibilities with any of these players because of the systematic restrictions that seem to have existed the last few years on offense.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there were segments of last season, we talked about it on the postgame show, where Race Thompson was the best player for Indiana. He did the most offensively and defensively. And so I think, if you can't find a way to fit him into what you're doing as an upperclassman in the Big Ten, your system is probably flawed more than it's him. And I agree. If you have three other guys out there that can shoot with him, and maybe he has more confidence to step out and do some things, or he's a guy who takes more of a screener's role. It's easy to kind of, look back at what happened over the last 4 years and just say, well, shoot, this guy didn't have a green light, and, these guys didn't feel comfortable shooting. Well, guess what? When Bob Knight was the coach, 75% of the roster didn't really feel comfortable shooting because they weren't shooters. And That was made clear to them. But this is the other piece of it that I think is going to be really important, which is if you're going to do that, and a guy is going to feel like part of his game is restricted because he has to fit a certain role, then you as the coach have to have the authority and the relationship with that player to get them to buy into a role. Mm-hmm. And this is where it really felt like things fell apart for Indiana. Is not only did guys kind of feel restricted, but they either didn't know or didn't buy into their role because they didn't trust what was going on, and they clearly didn't have a good enough relationship with the coach. I mean, when Scott Dolson listed the three things that the players said they wanted, it was relationship number 1, development number 2, and a more open offensive system number 3. Relationship number 1. It really is, I think, especially with where college sports are going and with the freedom that players have, it's more and more part of the secret sauce that kind of builds a culture and gets guys to stick around, is a feeling of belonging and a feeling of connection with their coach. These guys didn't have that. Mike Woodson seems, and again, we have to see how it plays out, but he seems like more of a natural, not only in wanting to do that, but being able to do that. And so where some optimism comes from is, because I think as you start looking, if guys come back, if Armand comes back, he's going to come back after, saying no to some really good options, same with Race. And if you get, this Xavier Johnson kid and you get a Cole Swider, or like whoever ends up coming, boy, you're starting to load up a roster with guys that are going to have expectations. And that in and of itself can be an issue. So that's where the coach's ability to build relationships, define roles, and get guys to buy into their roles is huge. And it's never felt to me over the last few years, really outside of Archie's first year, that he really had a team that really bought into their roles. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And I think, if Mike Woodson gets his wishes with all the guys that he wants to come in, clearly, that's going to be a challenge, a good challenge. You'd rather have more dudes than not enough dudes.
Right.
But when you get that, you have to be able to get guys to buy into their roles. And I feel like Archie just never really was able to do that.
Well, it felt like what we saw from the limited amount of time that we got the Archie Miller era, when he had a top-level player like a Romeo Langford or a Trayce Jackson-Davis, his conceptualization was that is the focal point of the offense, and everybody else essentially operates in service of that person's game. And that person's game is also kind of restricted to this particular thing that they do the best. And that will be the most efficient use of their time and our offensive possessions, as if everything is centered around that. I don't think that works in today's system. And I also think it certainly doesn't work if you don't have the relationships with the players where you can explain to guys, well, look, you're not shooting regularly. We're not having you do this or this, but this is why. And here are the results to demonstrate that it works. I will always wonder with Archie Miller, it might have simply been a matter of you get younger coaches who come up to this level and they don't always have the touch that's needed to interact with players on the level that they need to. And sometimes, especially when you're starting out really young as a coach, I think there's some concern that if you're too close to the players or if you're worried that they're not going to respect your authority. And who knows if that was actually the case or if it was something completely different. I'm totally speculating here. But Mike Woodson doesn't have to worry about that because Mike Woodson, he's coached in the NBA for 20 plus years. He has nothing to prove with this. He doesn't need to worry about, is a player going to respect me or not? If I, put my arm around them and talk them through a crisis that they're having or explain why they're doing what they're doing on the floor. Or not doing on the floor, as the case may be. That doesn't mean that it's going to be successful ultimately, but it does mean that at least that piece is going to be taken out of the equation. And he can always say, look, I've coached all of these top-level players at various stages of their career in the NBA. I've dealt with them. They all had positive things to say about me. Like that stuff really, it certainly resonates with me watching this from the outside and wondering whether it's going to work. And I think it'll resonate with players. It obviously resonated with Trayce Jackson-Davis. Like he specifically called that particular thing out in the press conference today. And so I'm assuming you're going to see similar things out of the players that decide to stay. It's always a juggling act. You're going to have players transfer, every year. It's just how it works in college basketball today. You're not going to make everybody happy, but people will be a lot happier sticking around and playing roles if they clearly understand why they're doing what they're doing. And if the team's winning, everybody ends up being frustrated and wanting to leave when the team isn't doing particularly well. So that's where it's going to be really interesting. And I'm curious to see how it plays out.
One of the narratives that's especially from kind of the national media around this whole concept of getting an IU guy, which comes up obviously, every time the job is open and also anytime the current coach has a bad game, it comes up. And it's kind of made out to seem like all IU fans just want Bob Knight 2.0. Like we just want to go back to exactly how things were, right? And now you've got Mike Woodson in, who was coached by Bob Knight, kind of an old school coach. And I feel like that's kind of the assumption that, that some people think that's how it's going to be. What do you think this is going to look like? Like what parts of this are going to look familiar to folks who have been watching Indiana basketball for 40, 50 years? And what's really going to look different? Obviously, the offensive system, it certainly seems like would look different. But what else about the way that things look and feel do you think will feel similar and will feel different?
Oh, man. Well, I want to come back to the first thing you said, but I'll answer your question first. I think what's going to look familiar is the care of the program and the way that players act within the program and the way that the program conducts itself. I think that what's been missing that many people in the IU fan base loved about the Bob Knight era is the sense of family and belonging that the fans had in being a part of something that felt much bigger than any one player. The only person that felt bigger than the program was Coach Knight, but he was also essentially the program. He was the common thread through which all of it ran. And I think you saw Mike Woodson mention this very directly in his opening press conference about having guys coming back and all the people that he thanked, and just the whole idea of having players back and be a part of things. You've seen it in all these ringing endorsements from former IU players that have talked about how many boxes Mike Woodson checks. I just don't feel like we've had that in the entire intervening 21 years since Knight was fired. Mike Davis, understandably, I think, was trying to chart his own path. There was a lot of bitterness and resentment from the people that had decided to split off and just be Bob Knight fans. Kelvin Sampson wasn't around long enough to really make a mark one way or the other. Tom Crean tried to lean into it a little bit, and then I think got resentful of the whole situation. And I don't know that Archie Miller ever really tried that much. So Mike Woodson coming back, I think there's a great opportunity there, and I think you're going to see it for IU fans to start to feel that familial sense. Now, there's going to have to be wins involved. Like, I don't think that people would have been that excited about the IU family if there hadn't been 3 national championships underpinning it. But, that reverence for the past in terms of, hey, we have a heritage, we have a history. Like, the IU basketball has been a blue blood program. It has been a dominant program in the past, but it's also been a program that represented something important to the people of Indiana and the culture of the alumni base of Indiana University. I think those things will be very similar from what we saw under Knight. Playing style? No. I mean, perhaps one of the laziest national media narratives I saw was this, are you trying to bring back the past with Mike Woodson? What the hell are you talking about? Mike Woodson walked out of the building in 1980. He didn't coach under Bob Knight. He didn't coach in college. I mean, the guy's been in the NBA for essentially 40 years. And what is that bringing back? Like, what it's just the laziest of narratives on the part of people who should know better, but frankly, on the part of people that seem to have some agendas in terms of how they're trying to portray this situation and the people involved. And that's what irritated me the most, I think, about that particular line, is that there's nothing about what Jesus. Let's start over again there. I got so worked up. It completely screwed up my delivery. But what Mike Woodson has done as a coach is not what Bob Knight did as a coach. It's not what he played under in the 4 years that he was at IU. It's an evolved version of the game. How will that work at IU? That's a legitimate question. And the question is, okay, are they just bringing back a name? But how many people were really clamoring for Mike Woodson as the connection to the past from IU basketball? It didn't exist. And I give Scott Dolson a lot of credit for not sticking within that narrow lane that most people thought that you would stick in if you were going to hire a former IU person. It wasn't Steve Alford. It wasn't, Dane Fife. It wasn't, somebody along those lines. It was somebody that has all of this other experience, all of this different perspective on basketball that they are now bringing to Assembly Hall. To me, that should be saluted, not derided.
Agreed. You mentioned Scott Dolson. As I've reflected on the coaching search and kind of talked with people, I think the common assumption was, okay, they went full force after Brad Stevens, and then they tried to figure out if they could get 5 or 10 of their other, best college coaching options, and then they settled on Mike Woodson. As I've kind of come to understand it and believe, without being told directly, but kind of starting to add things up, it really feels like Mike Woodson was option number 2, and that Scott Dolson basically had, maybe like 3 different templates in mind. Brad Stevens, template number 1, template number 2, let's get a guy like a Mike Woodson who we can pair with someone like in the CEO role that might have the experience, and let's lean back into who we are, but with someone that can also have a forward look, kind of inspired by Juwan Howard, but not necessarily the exact same template. And then option 3 is like, let's see if we can get a college guy. And it doesn't even really feel to me like they got there in any real earnest. And I'm curious if you feel the same way, because it really feels to me like this was option number 2. And in Scott Dolson's own mind, he hit a home run when he when this hire was made.
One of the big unfortunate aspects of this coaching search is that the narrative that grew up around the coaching search and what actually happened in the coaching search are two very different things. In the eyes of a lot of people who were following along with insiders or people who claimed that they know what was going on, IU tried with Brad Stevens and struck out. And then they tried with Chris Beard and then struck out. And then they tried with Thad Matta and struck out. And like there was this whole litany of people that they supposedly struck out on before they finally got to Mike Woodson. I don't think that's what happened at all. I think what you described is very correct. That, I think that there was enough smoke around the Brad Stevens thing. I think we can say they took a legitimate shot there, and who knows how close they were on that. But it takes a while to contact a person and to talk about, okay, what would this look like and how would this go? What was it? Friday, I think, of that first week was when Dolson went and talked to Woodson. Like that's 4 days into the coaching search. Mm-hmm. That's pretty early on. And the idea that they interviewed Mike Woodson and then were like, well, we're going to put you on a shelf while we interview all these other people and wait. No, that's the time that you're spending getting contract negotiations settled, having conversations with Thad Matta, who you've decided to also bring on. That would have taken a while to put together. And, I think what this probably highlighted was an idea on the part of Dolson that we need to do something different and we need to structure it differently. And we need someone who has a specific type of vision, who can figure out how to make this work, not in the traditional hire a coach and that coach goes and does all of the things and then stays isolated from the rest of the program. Instead, it's like, well, let's figure out a way to make IU basketball much more of a business operation than it has been, something that has a larger superstructure administratively. And so I'm with you 100%. I think if you're looking across at the various people, if you've got a guy like Mike Woodson that you feel can do the job, and obviously through the interviews, that's what it sounded like happened, then it's not a situation where you're settling for somebody. I think that they figured out pretty quickly. They knew going in, this is a person that we really think is among the top 2 or 3 candidates for the job.
You're in a really interesting position, working for IU as you do. I think really, because of the work you do with the sports media department and just some of the areas of study that you've had, I think really understanding how the business of sports works and kind of how things operate for smart athletic departments. My view from, living in Dallas, Texas, 1,000 miles away, as I've watched the evolution of Indiana's athletic department, is that it really seems like slowly but surely they are doing everything the right way and getting out ahead of where things are going. And what I mean by that is, the name, image, likeness stuff, the putting player mental health first, the student athlete bill of rights, that kind of stuff, hiring coaches that are focused on building cultures. Like, what's the sense that you get from inside? Because it feels like we're kind of starting to enter this golden era of IU sports that I think a lot of us from the 80s kind of remember. And it feels like we're getting there now, but not in a way that's kind of fluky and like we might win for a couple of years. But it feels to me like a foundation is really being built to last, that is looking at where things are going. And it's almost like the Wayne Gretzky line, you don't skate to where the puck is, you skate where it's going to be. I get the feeling like a lot of the decisions that are being made are with that in mind, which gives me a lot of confidence. Am I putting too much into it, or is that a fair assessment of how things are going?
I think that's fair. I mean, obviously people can take what I say with a grain of salt, because I work with people in the athletic department and I work for IU, and I don't think that's a secret. But I've been very critical of the athletic department at various times throughout the last 20 years, and I don't really see much to be critical about at this point. And I think a lot of the shots that have been taken at the athletic department over the last 5 to 6 years are really unfair in a lot of ways. It's really important to remember that IU athletics in the 1980s was about as good as you were going to get in college sports. It wasn't just basketball. It wasn't just men's basketball. You had championships in other sports. You had football at what the time was essentially its apex. And then essentially about a 15, 16 year period of atrophy and active retreat happened pretty much across the board. I mean, the only sport that was kind of unscathed by that was men's soccer. And maybe swimming and diving. But I mean, beyond that, it was a pretty desperate time. And there's individuals, some of them that were in athletics and some of them that were in the president's office, who you can specifically point the finger at and say, this is the reason why things went as badly as they did. But, since about 2008 or so, 2007, 2008, the level of infrastructure that was built, not just in terms of buildings, but in terms of departmental structure, in terms of people being assigned to jobs that made sense, that were not just forward thinking from a sports perspective, but from a business perspective, from a marketing perspective, we've really started to see the rewards of those things being reaped finally. People look at IU in 2012 and say, well, why aren't we Kentucky? Why aren't we North Carolina? And it's like, because those programs, those athletic departments were doing the right things the previous 15 years. And that was probably the most crucial period of time in athletics history where college sports turned into a business. It wasn't just a thing that you did as a university. It was like you have to dedicate yourself to making this good year after year. And I think IU's done a tremendous job of digging themselves out of the hole that was dug during that period, and also putting all these things on top of it, so that now you've got top level coaches in several sports. You've got top facilities in most sports. It's a really cool time to be an IU fan, and I think it's probably just going to get better as we move forward.
It's clear that we haven't talked enough recently, because I have like 8,000 different topics here that I want to talk to you about. So we're bouncing around a little bit.
We can get a little longer. That's fine.
Well, I want to pull it back to the team, and I want to pull it back to looking at next year. I texted someone last night, half joking, but half not, with the question, why can't we compete for a Big Ten title next year? And I know it sounds crazy, but part of the thought was, hey, and this was before I knew Trayce was coming back, but it's kind of like projecting, okay, we're going to get some of these players back. Right. But it was also looking at what's coming back in the Big Ten. The Big Ten is losing a lot. Illinois is not going to be as good. Wisconsin's not going to be as good. Iowa's losing a lot. So there's a lot of teams that were kind of up top that are going to fall back down. And now if Indiana is able to bring back some of these experienced players and we get this, this kind of bump that we're all hoping under the new staff, it feels like there's an opportunity in the Big Ten to make a big jump if Indiana's ready to do it. And again, they have to actually be ready. And I'm almost sure that they can't actually compete for a Big Ten title, but I'm not sure it's crazy to think that if you get some of these guys back, that they could be a top 4 or 5 team in the Big Ten as soon as next year. Meaning we've gotten so conditioned to feeling like the first year is like this throwaway year that's just going to be a slog and there's really no chance to compete. And I'm looking at the Big Ten landscape and kind of seeing the feeling of how things are, which we haven't felt in the first season under a new coach in a while. And it's like, I think there's some potential for next year for this to be a pretty darn good season.
It's possible. I think so much of the problem that IU is going to have to overcome is learning how to win again.
Yeah.
Because it feels like, look, you can have a better system in place. You can have players with a year more of experience. You can have more confidence. All of those things help a lot. Until you learn how to win games and learn psychologically what you need to do in order to win games, I don't know that we could count on them competing for a Big Ten title. Certainly top 4. I don't see why that would be out of play. I think all the years in the Archie Miller era, like that's what we kept waiting on. It's like all these unrealistic expectations from IU fans. It's like, oh yeah, finish over 500 in the conference, and maybe get a double bye in the conference tournament. Like perish the thought. I think those things are certainly within reach. Winning a Big Ten title is tough. Like there aren't a lot of accidental Big Ten champs in the conference's history, and the core group of players, if everybody came back and you added a couple of new pieces and everything went right in practice and Mike Woodson was able to convince everybody of what roles they needed to play, and they were also running the right offensive and defensive systems, sure, that's a lot of ifs.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm really looking for, if IU could, so this year they finished 7-12 in conference. Can they finish 5 games over or 4 games over 500 in conference? I mean, that's a huge leap. But that's what you're talking about if you're going to compete for a Big Ten title. So at this point, give me an 8 seed in the NCAA tournament. Get me to Friday in the Big Ten tournament. I think that's a great first step, particularly if you can get Trayce Jackson-Davis drafted in that same season. Like that's some really good stuff to build off of.
Yeah, no, and I don't actually think that would happen. I think Purdue's going to be really good next year. Michigan's going to be really talented. Those seem like the two kind of obvious ones. Who else kind of projects? And I didn't give you a chance to prep for this, but who else kind of projects to be really good next year in the Big Ten? Because I think after that, there's a lot of question marks.
There are a lot of question marks. I mean, I think Michigan State's going to be better than they were this year. I mean, that's a team. I know they're losing Rocket Watts, I think, but that was a relatively young team for Tom Izzo this year, and I think that's a team that had everything go wrong, and they still made the NCAA tournament this year. So I like their possibilities, and I think Ohio State's going to be tough as well. They're not really losing anybody that I think is a tremendous loss. I think C.J. Walker is maybe leaving, and I think Kyle Young.
E.J. Liddell said he's going pro.
Oh, I guess E.J. Okay, I forgot about the Liddell thing. So maybe not Ohio State either. I think your point is well taken. It's an up-in-the-air Big Ten. We're going to have to wait to see what happens with the transfers because we got guys switching teams in conference and stuff like that. I mean, it's a crazy scene right now. So at that point, that's where you have to look at, okay, what coaches have demonstrated that they can take a variety of parts and in most years do what they need to do. And I think, you look at Izzo, you look at Painter, you look at Holtman. Right now, I think those guys, better than anybody else, probably have the shot of doing it. And
unless Matt Painter's coaching at North Carolina.
That'd be tremendous. Would love it. Just make it. Maybe he'll coach at Loyola. They're making competitive offers. He needs another raise, so he has to go, fake interest in another job somewhere, right?
Oh man. You talk about the transfers and how crazy it is. And it is. And boy, it's going to be interesting to see how this is going to go moving forward. 5 years from now, do you think the transfer rule will still be as it is, or do you think that there's going to be some unintended consequences that happen that force a change?
They're going to change it. I mean, the only reason they didn't change it this year is because, I don't know if there's a way for the NCAA to get more bad press than it already has gotten, but that would be the way to do it, is in the middle of a pandemic, say, well, sorry, you can't transfer. We're going to make you stay where you're at. But it's a huge concern among coaches, among athletic directors. And, it's also going to be something, I think, if you do end up with a name, image, likeness agreement or something that deals with cost of attendance, I think at that point, colleges and universities will just be like, look, we got to stop this. Like this is not a way to sustain things in college sports. And so that's, it's interesting because it's not happening to that degree in football. It happens somewhat. You do get some transfers, but basketball is off on its own little orbit right now. So I wouldn't be shocked to see, as soon as things get relatively back to normal, maybe we get through a full normal season of college basketball, you'll see some major changes on that front. I think you almost have to at this point if you're college sports.
Last question for you, and folks who are here live, if you have a question for Galen, pop it into the...
Someone asked me if I had any Lawrence Funderburk videos to post from when he was. You realize how few Lawrence Funderburk games there were? What was it like? Were there 6?
Yeah,
maybe 7.
Yeah.
I don't think I might have one, but I don't even know where the tape is right now. So anyway, I apologize. If anybody's got any on DVD they'd like to send me, I'd be happy to post it.
The last topic I want to hit with you is Thad Matta. It was interesting the day that Mike Woodson was hired. It was like, okay, we hired Mike Woodson, but oh my God, the Thad Matta thing is great. And now, like in the week since, Mike Woodson is, introduces the coach. I thought did a really impressive job at the press conference laying out the vision, and people were like, okay. Now he's getting Kenya Hunter back. He's getting Parker Stewart back. There's been some social media pictures. He's getting Trayce Jackson-Davis back. Now all the focus is on Mike Woodson again. And then, today I was thinking to myself, I was like, oh man, we got Thad Matta too, like, now he's not going to be a guy who's really out front, but how important is that? What do you kind of understand of what his role is going to be, and how important do you think he is? I mean, this is like one of the 2 most successful Big Ten coaches of the last 20 years. And I mean, he's going to have a big impact. We just don't quite know exactly what it's going to be yet.
I'll be clear on this. If he was not having health issues, he would have been my number 1 choice for coach, like without question. I think that guy has just a tremendous basketball mind. He's got a tremendous degree of understanding of the college game, of the Big Ten in particular. I think it's really interesting because no one really knows exactly what the role is going to look like. But if I had to guess, I would say there's a few things that are important with what Thad Matta is going to bring to the table. One of them is all of the things that you need from a logistical perspective in terms of figuring out who goes on the basketball floor, what players you're pursuing from a recruiting perspective, what film you're watching in terms of upcoming opponents. Like those are things that certainly you're having assistant coaches do, but you've got someone in place who understands all that stuff, who really desperately wants to be part of a basketball program again, but physically can't do all of the legwork, quite literally. Now there's a role for him. And this is a really fascinating role because it doesn't really exist in college sports, at least not in college basketball like this. I mean, maybe there's some other place. I know somebody threw up Arizona State as a possibility. It's not quite the same there. Like it's almost like a pro style setup where you've got someone in the back room who's doing all of this additional work. And then you've got the head coach who's out there essentially being the front man for things and also making all the in-game decisions. So I think it's still yet to be seen exactly what that will entail. But I don't think he's just going to be sitting around and, calling people and talking about how great IU basketball is. I think there's going to be a lot more involved than that. Like his salary, I think he's getting paid like $450,000 a year.
Yeah.
And that goes up like $25,000 a year every year that he stays. That tells me it's a pretty important role. And that tells me that what they're doing is not making Mike Woodson's job easier per se, but adding another brain to the mix, adding another set of eyes, and not just helping with the transition of Mike Woodson to the college game, but also helping IU in the transition to being a serious basketball program again. And, you had a guy like Bob Knight, who I think in the 80s and 90s had the capacity to do all of that himself. And there are certainly some coaches who are capable of doing all of that themselves right now. Tom Izzo, Roy Williams, he just retired, Mike Krzyzewski. There aren't a whole lot of other people that are really capable of doing that year in and year out. And so if we look at IU basketball and we look at, okay, in this era, in the 2020s and beyond, we're going to take IU basketball from the kind of super advanced mom and pop operation that it's been and turn it into something that can compete with the Kentuckys and the Kansases and the North Carolinas on the recruiting trail, on the scouting front, on the player development front. This is probably the best way to do it. And I'm fired up about Matta being a part of it. I'm also fired up about Mike Woodson getting more of the attention because I did feel bad that first couple of days. Everybody was talking about the Matta thing and everybody's like, I don't know about the Woodson thing. Obviously, it wasn't Thad Matta that sat down with Trayce Jackson-Davis and his parents and talked with them for 2 hours about his game. It was Mike Woodson. So I think both of them bring a lot to the table, and I understand the tendency that fans and media have of concentrating on one storyline at the exclusion of all others. But I think in this case, you've got two really cool storylines happening simultaneously.
Hey, we had a request. We did a happy hour in our community, and some people requested that we do some live game rewatches. Remember, like we did when the pandemic started, of all of the classic in-state tournament games? Some folks requested we do some live game rewatches of classic Mike Woodson games to kind of bring folks up to speed. Do you have any Mike Woodson games on your treasure trove of a YouTube channel?
I think I've got at least a couple from his senior year, and there's obviously the NIT championship against Purdue. That video is in pretty bad shape. But let me dig through, see what we can do. I think we might be able to do something along these lines. Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Yeah.
That would be fun. Well, Galen, this was awesome. The time went by really fast.
It did.
Good to catch up and talk about some fun IU basketball topics.
Always a pleasure, Jared. I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate everybody in the chat for sticking around and watching things. And we'll do it again soon. I think there's going to be a lot to talk about, both in the next couple of weeks and certainly in the 7 or 8 months that we have to wait until the basketball season fires up again.
Man, the enthusiasm since the firing of Archie and the hiring has been, the pent-up enthusiasm this fan base had is unbelievable.
This is not a bad fan base. I keep saying it, but it's a fan base that has a lot of reason to get frustrated. And the thing is, ultimately, when you give them hope, they will jump behind the person 100%. They'll jump behind the program 100%. And I'm really thrilled that things are going the way that they're going right now. we'll see what happens. Who knows? You can't project the future, but I'm excited. And it does. I mean, whether it's the fans on Twitter or on the message boards, or whether it's Trayce Jackson-Davis today, it feels like 1,000-pound weight was lifted off of everybody's shoulders. With just the firing and just this changeover, and it feels like a new dawn. And I think I really have come around to feeling like we've got the right guy in place. That one last story, I was meeting with a prospective student this morning, and he and his mom come into Franklin Hall, and they're like, we're staying at the Graduate Hotel down the street, and we're coming out and getting ready to walk down here for our tour, and we see Coach Woodson, and so they kind of waved and said hi, and he calls them over, and he asks for the kid's name, and wants to get his full name, and asks him what he's planning on studying, and takes a picture with him and all that. And that's really cool. That kind of thing. Coaches don't have to do that. We've probably had coaches that haven't wanted to do that for one reason or another. But to just be randomly greeting prospective IU students and talking with them there on the street like that tells me we might have the right guy in place here.
I think so. It's a great note to end on. Galen, thanks for joining us on the Assembly Call. We will talk to you guys for sure next Thursday, but I don't know if Armand Franklin announces that he's coming back. I might have to do another emergency episode and talk about that. I like these emergency episodes when good stuff happens. These are fun. I like doing these.
This is the great thing about not having a schedule, Jared. I've been telling you for years.
I know. It's fun. Just pop on when good stuff happens. Very fun. All right, Galen, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for being here live, and we will talk to you all soon. All right, now stick around for my conversation with Sam Vecenie from The Athletic and the Game Theory podcast coming up right now. All right, very happy to be joined by Sam Vecenie from The Athletic to talk about Trayce Jackson-Davis. Sam, first, just your reaction to the news that Trayce is foregoing the NBA, going pro to stay in Bloomington for another year.
Yeah, it was an interesting decision, to be sure. I think it's the right decision, personally, because I think that there is a lot of specific room for growth within his game. And what he got to show this year was it was an incredibly effective year. He's an incredibly effective college basketball player. Certainly an all Big Ten level player, so I don't mean to diminish him. But what he got to show specifically this year was not great tape for NBA evaluators and what they're looking for in a translation to the modern game. Obviously, Indiana posted him up a crazy amount, right? That was the center of their offense. They wanted to post him a ton. He had a ton of dump-off opportunities where he'd be in the dunker spot. Someone like Armand would drive, hit him in the dunker spot, and he'd go up and finish. He uses the basket to shield his way from defenders really well and has really, really good positioning around the basket. He knows how to use his body to protect the ball, knows how to use the basket to protect the ball and finish around the basket. But this is stuff that a lot of guys in the NBA can do, where he needs to be able to differentiate himself. He needs to be able to make high-level passing reads. He needs to be able to hopefully knock down shots because, Trayce Jackson-Davis are we sure he's 6'9" even? He's probably, 6'8.5", 6'9.5", somewhere in that range. So not elite center size, honestly going to be an undersized center in the NBA if he has to play that position. So he needs to be able to knock down shots, hopefully needs to be able to play some four. And I think that his defense in space and his ability to kind of slide down and guard fours particularly, not necessarily fives, but fours, is something that he could show. I just don't know if he can do it yet. It's not that I'm saying he can't do it. We just haven't seen it because it wasn't his role at Indiana the last couple.
Yeah. Obviously the big one is shooting. And he mentioned today in his press availability that Mike Woodson basically told him, if you don't shoot jump shots, I'm going to take you out. Basically saying, I want you to do this in games. Given what you've seen, he's been in the mid-60s as a free throw shooter. He doesn't have the quintessential release on his jump shot. How confident are you that he can develop into a passable shooter?
Yeah. Honestly, not wildly confident just from what we've seen, but I have heard that he's a really good worker. I've heard that he really puts time and effort in. And to me, that's a huge part of the battle. I think the guys that we often see not improve as shooters are the guys that don't have that great work ethic and don't have that great reputation for putting time in the gym, right? And putting time in the gym the right way. Look, Mike Woodson's coming from the NBA. He's coming from a modern league, and even 15 years ago when he was, or 12 years ago, whenever he started coaching the Hawks. I think it was 15. Where he was at the forefront of wanting his guys to step out and shoot. He wants his guys to go out there and knock down shots, let alone what he's learned over the course of the last 5 years, where we've really jumped into big shooting the three-point ball. Trayce Jackson-Davis is going to have to shoot within the flow of this offense, and it's going to be a problem for him in Indiana if he doesn't. And given what we've seen touch-wise, he's a good toucher around the basket. The problem is that, he made 3 of his 18 catch-and-shoot jumpers last year, according to Synergy. He made 1 of his 11 floater opportunities. Those kind of metrics, don't really... It's small sample, obviously. You don't want to read too much into it, but they don't really portend a crazy amount of improvement. We've seen crazier things, though, and if he's willing to work at it and willing to make some of that touch with his left hand, particularly around the basket, the real thing, maybe it can happen. But I think it's worth the risk for him to go back and try to prove that, because at the end of the day, even if he doesn't prove that he can shoot, he's still probably going to be a guy that averages 17 points a game and, does similar to what he did this year at the end of the day, right? Going back and trying to prove that he can shoot, I think is a worthwhile venture for him, because the upside, if he does, I think is genuinely that he could be a first-round pick if he returns and knocks down shots.
Does it suggest anything to you about Mike Woodson and how this might go at Indiana, that he was able to convince Trayce to come back? And is there anything from Mike's experience in the NBA that suggests to you that Indiana fans should have confidence in how this is going to go?
So, this is something I kind of mentioned on my podcast on, I don't even know what day it is. I think it's Thursday. I think it's Friday there. I think I podcasted Wednesday. I think that the people have been joking, poo-pooing the oh yeah, Mike Woodson has NBA experience. Nobody knows who Mike Woodson is. That's not going to be a thing that matters. I'm sure you've seen that, right?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
I actually really disagree with that kind of fundamentally, because I think it's actually a very compelling argument. To me, the name recognition of someone like a Juwan Howard, which is what it's often compared to, right? The name recognition of someone like Juwan Howard is going to get you in the door, right? Maybe it's going to get you into doors that you couldn't have gotten into previously. With Mike Woodson, the Indiana brand is going to get him into the door, I think. And at the end of the day, the argument that he makes regarding, convincing parents and kids to spend their 1 to 4 years with him is going to be what matters. Juwan Howard isn't getting guys because his name is Juwan Howard. Juwan Howard might be getting in the door because his name is Juwan Howard, but Juwan Howard is also an incredibly charismatic human being who has an incredibly compelling story, who is also able to convince kids to come and play for Michigan. Mike Woodson, the key for him is going to be proving that he can provide that compelling story about who he is. Former Indiana player, former Big Ten Player of the Year, if I remember correctly, in terms of the actual award.
Mm-hmm.
Made it to the NBA. But the compelling that I think is, or the argument that I think is most compelling, is I coached in the NBA for 15 years. He doesn't need name recognition to make that argument.
Mm-hmm.
That argument is going to happen within those doors, and he's going to get in those doors because he is the head coach of Indiana, and that is going to matter. And then once he makes that argument, look, you hear from recruits all the time. I talk to recruits. I talk to kids that are anywhere from 16 to 22 years old. The thing they care about most now is it's not a thing where college basketball is the dream now, right? Like, we've entered a different paradigm of what college basketball is. These kids didn't grow up watching fucking Mike Woodson, right? They didn't grow up
right.
watching Cody Zeller even, right? Who was an All-American at Indiana. And like, they didn't grow up watching Victor Oladipo and like think of his time with the Hoosiers, right? They think of Victor Oladipo as the guy who made an All-NBA team with the Indiana Pacers and, you know, who is just been traded to Miami Heat instead. So the argument that I think is most compelling for recruits right now is I can get you to the NBA. I can get you to where you want to go, especially guys that are 4- and 5-star recruits.
Yeah.
So Mike Woodson can reasonably make that argument. I think that he's going to be able to make that argument better than most coaches in the NBA. I don't know if Mike Woodson's going to work or not. Like, it might not work at the end of the day. Like, we've never seen him coach college basketball. We don't know what it's going to look like. But I think that he has a more compelling argument as a recruiter and a more compelling argument as a coach than what a lot of people have kind of portrayed at the end of the day.
Last question for you. I know your time is limited. Anybody else on the Indiana roster, and for purposes of this discussion, we can assume Armaan Franklin as a part of the Indiana roster. Anyone else on your radar screen for the NBA draft?
Yeah, Armaan is definitely one. Very interesting guard, you know, can run some pick and roll, can shoot it a little bit. Really, I think needs to work on some decision-making stuff, but has a lot of tools to be like kind of a combo-y guard at the next level if it goes really right. It would have to go really right for him, I think. But, you know, that's not an impossible situation. Let me pull up Indiana's roster here. I'm like trying to like think on.
Lander would probably be the other one
here
because of his 5-star pedigree, even though he didn't show much this year.
Yeah, no, I think Christian got to college basketball and was like, 170 goddamn pounds?
If that,
right?
yeah.
Like, I think people underrate, and plus the history of these guys who decide to reclassify up. Like, I would seriously, if people are listening to this and you guys have kids that are like 5-star point guards or whatever, do not reclassify up. Take the time to keep developing on the high school level. The track record is bad. Nico Mannion hurt his stock. Derek Thornton was not very good. Ashton Hagans did not help himself, but he had to go a second year at Kentucky. The track record is long. It's vast. Stay the extra year in high school. Continue your development incrementally, because playing point guard at the college level when you're 17 years old is exceptionally difficult. So I wouldn't read anything into Lander being bad. Next year is an incredibly important year for him, though. And he's definitely on the radar of scouts. You know, Parker Stewart certainly, you know, has had a great career at UT Martin, and you know, has a shot to be like a shooter and like maybe a 3-and-D guy if it went really right. Tennessee, I don't really see as like, you know, an NBA player necessarily. Jerome Hunter, I don't really see as an NBA player. You know, Race Thompson can like theoretically be like a 6'8" shooter, but I don't really see that in terms of him as an NBA player. So, yeah, I think it's Armaan and Christian, and then obviously Trayce are the 3 guys.
Yeah. Sam, really appreciate the time on short notice. Listen to his podcast, Game Theory Podcast. Read his work on The Athletic. Any place else people need to be finding your work?
No, that's it. No, I appreciate it, Jared.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate it. All right. Well, that will do it for this emergency episode of the Assembly Call. Hope you enjoyed it. I mean, it's all about Trayce Jackson-Davis coming back. What's not to enjoy? I don't think we could ruin that. But no, thanks for being here. We will, of course, be there if any more breaking news happens. Otherwise, we will talk to you guys next Thursday for Assembly Call Radio. So have a great weekend, and talk to you soon.
I like everything about that.